with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Pam and Lam Richert are co-founders and co-directors of Eco-Justice Collaborative, now based in Champaign, Illinois. They also are 50% of the reason why this series has been so good. They were members of this planning committee, and many of the great speakers you've had came because they asked. So they get credit for that as well as doing a talk. So they've done most of the work here. While raising her family, Pam received her BA in Human Ecology in 1978 and her MA in Human Environmental Planning from Governor State University. From 1982 through 2008, Pam was employed by Planning Resources, Inc., an environmental and land use consulting firm founded in 1982. During that time, she served as senior planner and vice president and director of planning. She became owner of the firm in 1996. An ecologist by training, Lan received his bachelor's in zoology in 1971 and his master's degree in biology in 1976 from this very university. In 1983, he also joined Planning Resources, Inc., where in conjunction with Pam and a senior partner, he helped establish the firm as one of Chicago's leading planning, environmental, and landscape architectural firms. Serving as vice president and then president, he had responsibility for business development and operations for the 18-person firm and directed the environmental department and technical studies related to preparation of environmental impact assessment, natural resource protection, and impact mitigation design. In 2000, Pam and Lan decided to infuse eco-justice into their work and began the process of transitioning both leadership and ownership of PRI. This enabled them to start the Eco-Justice Collaborative with its mission that advocates ecological sustainability and just distribution of resources. Please welcome Pam and Lan Richert.
Thank you, Cassie. Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, be part of the Friday Forum tradition. As Cassie said, both Pam and I attended the University of Illinois. We met here at a little bar called Trino's, if you recall that. Married, started our family here, and subsequently left for Chicago for career employment. And as Cassie mentioned, for about 20 years or more, we ran an environmental land use planning firm called Planning Resources. We did a lot of environmental impact work as well as land use planning and some landscape architecture. Began to see the relationship of our public actions and the consequences, both pro and con. We eventually became very interested in social justice and spent a lot of time in Latin America, working on human rights issues and social justice issues related to land reform, and a lot of it relating to U.S. policy and how that impacted the people and the land in those areas. So when we started Eco-Justice Collaborative, we had sold our firm. We started Eco-Justice Collaborative. It was a bringing together, a melding of the two aspects of an environmental consciousness, environmental impact analysis, and the social justice. So that's why we're Eco-Justice Collaborative. Now, over the years, our work has had many aspects. We've been in a lot of projects and varying campaigns. Most recently, working in central and southern Illinois with coal communities, communities that have been literally punished by the boom and bust cycle of the coal extraction economic process, jobs coming and going. That is why we came back to Champaign, and we've now been here for about 3 years to work on those issues. Even though Illinois, and particularly southern Illinois, sits on some of the most vast resources of coal in the U.S., it's continued to be plagued by high unemployment, poverty rates, local economies that have been devastated. And we hear a lot about the war on coal, and that's a convenient, I think, political advantageous, I think, in some circles to talk about a war on coal. as though there are these evil forces that are out there trying to stifle an industry, to destroy an industry, when in fact these forces are really efforts to protect human health, to protect worker safety, to protect the people. There are market forces such as the rising natural gas prices, et cetera. There are market forces from the increase in renewables and stiff competition. So there really is no war on coal. We're moving away from coal. The other things we hear is putting miners back to work. And that's a great message. And if you are a miner who's unemployed, that is a beautiful message. In reality, the future does not look good for coal. If we step back and look at a long-term trend, we can see that we're moving out of the fossil fuel era, and we're moving necessarily towards one of sustainability, one of renewable energy. And so betting on the return of coal jobs, betting on the return of the coal industry is probably not a good wager right now. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be good years and interspersed by maybe bad years, but in the long term, coal is in a decline. The real issue isn't how to go back to the past, how to resurrect an industry from the past. The real issue is how do we make that transition in a way that doesn't leave people behind, that doesn't leave communities behind. Some folks call it the just transition. It's bringing justice into the process as we move away from fossil fuels and into the renewable energy realm. So today what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about the effect of coal on Illinois communities. We're going to talk about regional, national trends in coal production and consumption. We're going to talk about the role of coal in the state's economy, which may have some surprises for you. We're going to talk about externalized costs. Those are costs that we pay, but they're not directly in the price that we pay. And then we're going to talk about, importantly, revitalizing the heartland, a way that we think is a small part of the picture of providing community benefits and payback to local communities. Pam and I are going to do kind of a tag team, as we often do. So she's going to begin, she'll start out, and then we'll pick up and alternate as we go through.
Thanks, Lan. We've done this dance for about 40 years. So it's good to see you all here today. And I see you all have evaluations. If by the time we're finished talking about coal and communities, we haven't achieved our goal of helping everybody understand and support a concept that says coal needs to pay its fair share and communities need to benefit, then you give us that low grade. But hopefully by the time we get through with this, you will be ready to rock and roll with us as we move on in this campaign. So let's start a little bit about talking about the effect on Illinois communities. I've lived in Illinois all my life. Much of it has been north of I-80 in the Chicago metropolitan area. And I will say that for me, I didn't really have a good understanding of the small rural towns that dot the landscape in central and southern Illinois. And so maybe you're coming into this with a better knowledge set than I did. But at first, I want to just share with you that some of what we're going to be showing today is something that had to be learned. It wasn't intuitive, and it wasn't something that I kind of came here knowing. So one of the things that we have learned and have worked with others, many in this room, on coal-related issues, Sierra Club, Prairie Rivers Network, and Faith in Place in particular. I learned that Illinois coal is a huge resource in the state of Illinois. In fact, it underlies 2/3 of the state. We have an Illinois coal basin that kind of moves into Kentucky a little bit and moves into Indiana a bit, but predominantly that resource underlies our state. And much of the coal is high-energy bituminous coal, and that is becoming something more and more rare as we in this country mine out our fossil resource. According to the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, Illinois' coal reserves contain more BTUs than the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait combined. So we've been dubbed and named the Saudi Arabia of coal. If you haven't heard that yet, maybe you will at some time in the future, and that's why. We also have a high sulfur content, which means that power plants can't burn our coal here in this country unless they're retrofitted with the appropriate pollution control equipment. We'll talk more about that as we go on. Illinois is a top coal producer. If you had to kind of guess where it stood in the top 25, where would you put it? 4, he's right. It was 3 in 2016. It's been hovering around 4 and 5 for some time. Mines in Illinois produce as much as 6% of the coal in this country, and we have the second largest recoverable reserves in the country, second only to Wyoming. And because we have so much coal, we have a long history with that resource. And it's a real interesting resource, I think. You could do a whole presentation on that if we had time. Coal was first discovered by white Europeans as early as 1673 along the Illinois River, right here in this state. By 1918, we had 100,000 miners mining coal for the World War I effort. You might know that Kickapoo State Park was mined. You might not know that just 30 miles from here, we had the first mechanized strip mining equipment in the country, right there at Kickapoo. Illinois coal mining has been at the forefront of labor organizing. The Progressive Mine Workers of America started here in 1932 in their quest for higher wages. And Mother Jones, we all know Mother Jones, right? A prominent labor representative and a community activist, formerly a school teacher and a seamstress who put down her work, totally changed her life, to become a co-founder of the Industrial Workers of the World. But she's buried right here in Illinois, in Mount Olive, which is not, an hour and a half from here off 57. She's buried and lies among the victims of the Battle of Verdun, which was a war of miners versus the mining companies, and one of many that took place here in Illinois as workers tried to organize for good paying wages and appropriate hours. But Mother Jones asked to be buried here in Illinois as a way to honor those who she believed really represented the best labor activities in the entire country, right here in Illinois. We're also home to some of the biggest mining disasters that have ever occurred in the country, including a 1947 explosion in Centralia that took 111 lives, and a fire at the Cherry Mine disaster in 1909 that killed 259 people, and I think that probably holds the record still for being the worst disaster. And amidst all of this, you have a very proud heritage of coal miners that live and dot the landscape in central and southern Illinois. They're hard workers, let me tell you that. They put their lives at risk so we can benefit from the resource that they mine. And often, families have a legacy of miners. It kind of runs in the blood. If you meet a mining family, you're going to learn that dad was a miner and granddad was a miner and maybe even great-granddad was a miner, and it's in their blood. And as we talk about the opportunities for moving forward with a coal severance tax, I think that plays a lot into the experiences we have had as we've talked with folks in central and southern Illinois. Coal also helped fuel our country's industrial revolution. The coal boom that took place in the 1860s went hand in hand with the development of a railroad system, and that allowed coal companies to get the coal to markets. It was really, really important for rapidly industrializing cities at the time. And if you live here in Illinois, you know that you've probably driven through them. There's many, many, many towns named after coal. You know, Carbon Hill, Coal Valley, Carbondale, Diamond among them. This is where I think it's appropriate to start beginning to talk about impacts to communities, because as those towns first formed with the coal boom, they were prosperous. People came there to get what was considered to be good paying jobs. The communities thrived. But later, as mining activities wound down, as the resource was harder and harder to get, the communities were left with a mono economy that no longer supported the people in the town and the economy that was needed to live in prosperity. So once the area was mined out, the coal companies left. So all across Illinois, the story of coal and communities is a story of boom and bust. It's good when it's there, and then they leave. And they came back again often as technologies changed, and one was more able to access resources that had been left behind, so there was another boom. But this struggle of boom and bust and story continues to take place today. I'm going to just go through this pretty quickly, but there's communities like this that dot the landscape all across the state. This is Carrier Mills in Saline County, and it's a photo in 1928 at its heyday. And it was home to hotels and movie theaters, banks, stores, everything you needed to live, and its economy was solely based on coal. The town's business district, however, has been in a slow, steady decline for over 25 years, and as the mines began to close, people were put out of work. Some of the closure was related to mining out the resource, but another blow happened when the Clean Air Act was amended in 1990, which had devastating consequences for the coal industry. Those regulations required power plants to limit their sulfur dioxide emissions, and the sulfur content of Illinois coal is particularly high. And faced with a choice between installing expensive equipment so the utilities could continue to burn Illinois coal, they instead decided to import coal from Wyoming, and that brought our industry to a crushing halt. It also left a lot of resource in the ground, which is one reason why we have so much of it today. Some of those companies had a reputation for buying locally, and when their purchasing power ceased, it was a huge blow to local businesses. And with hundreds of people unemployed, the downtown with its vacant storefronts and its streets began to deteriorate, and by 2006, most of Carrier Mills, all the downtown buildings, most of them were condemned and have been demolished by the city. Residents said it was better to see empty lots than the deteriorating buildings. And also, hand in hand with that, was a 44% reduction in their population. Now today, this community, as many others, are looking for ways to revitalize their town. They have a plan, but what they don't have is funding. And there are exceptions to this. I don't want to leave anyone thinking here that everything in southern Illinois and central Illinois, south of where we are today, looks like that, because that's not true. But what is true is most every town has had the experience of trying to deal with this boom and bust economy of coal, and it's far more prevalent than I ever realized. Now, funds made during the Obama administration's presidency were hoping to deal with this kind of situation and provide help to communities struggling with this boom and bust economy, but those were limited to Appalachia, and Illinois did not qualify. So we think communities like Carrier Mills, and we hope you think so too, and the many others that dot the landscape across Illinois, who would benefit from a small tax on coal, could, I'm saying the sentence all wrong, but they would benefit from a small tax on coal to help diversify their economies. So keep that in mind as we talk about the importance of the coal severance tax.
So let's take a look at the regional and national importance of coal. And Pam always likes me to do the graphs. I'm not sure why, but anyway, this is a graph of energy consumption in the U.S. In quadrillion BTUs, and from 1775, I think it is, 1776 to 2015. And what we see, this line right here is biomass, presumably wood, starting out in 1775. Around 1850, coal becomes more important and rapidly rises to be the most important fuel around. Shortly after the war, we start seeing petroleum take off. But the real message here is in coal, and what has happened as we get over to this point, natural gas has become a competitor. And as we are now, about late 2014, 2015, when natural gas prices really plummeted, you see natural gas become much more prevalent, and coal starts to drop off the map, or appears to so. Actually, in terms of actual this is energy consumption both in the past, a history, and in the future projections from the Energy Information Association or Administration. And what we see here is the same thing. Around present time, we see that natural gas is outcompeting coal, and coal is taking this drop. And what we're about here, and the projections from the Energy Information Administration are that coal will probably increase slightly in the coming years, the short term, but overall we're looking at a gradual drop, a gradual flattening and drop. The takeaway here is that the U.S. is on a decline in terms of coal, but it's not going away. We assume that coal is going to be disappearing rapidly, but for the foreseeable future, coal is going to be part of our energy mix. A short time ago was about 40%, contributed 40% to our electricity generation. Now it's down to about 30. Natural gas is at 34%. But coal's not going to go away, and there also are fluctuating markets internationally. So we're going to have some coal around. Another takeaway is that Illinois has a strong position in the coal market. This graph shows a change in U.S. coal production, and this is percent change. So a positive line here shows the acceleration of coal production. This goes through about 2013. So what we see, this is Illinois taking off. It was increasing production dramatically as other basins such as central and northern Appalachia and the Powder River Basin were declining in increase. This is an increase in production. So Illinois is in a very positive position. As long as coal is around, we believe coal is going to be mined in Illinois. So the question becomes, if coal is such an important fuel, if it's continuing to be mined, then why aren't the people of central and southern Illinois coal mining communities prospering? Why don't they have more jobs? Why isn't it a steady economy? Why aren't their downtowns at least stable and sustainable? A lot of the reason is based on mechanization.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that, role in our economy and the jobs. Mechanization is, as Lan said, really the key. Today, about 60% of the coal mined in this state is mined through a highly mechanized form of mining called longwall mining. And this technology allows coal operators to extract as much as 90% or more of the coal resource as compared with 50 to 60, maybe even a little bit higher than that with more traditional forms of mining like room and pillar and strip mining, which is a bit higher than room and pillar. But it also drops the land by 4 to 6 feet. It's planned as the machines advance forward, shearing off the coal from the wall underground. The ground overhead drops the depth of the coal seam. And because it's machine-driven, it requires far fewer jobs and more traditional methods of mining. And that exacerbates the bust of the coal cycle. This graph puts things into an historical perspective. As you can see, as the lines on this graph go on the screen here, in the early 1900s, there were over 100,000 miners producing about 90 million tons of coal. And it was until the late 1940s that coal mining actually was still very labor intensive. Thank you for that. But after that period, jobs and production were no longer so closely correlated. And as coal production has remained relatively stable over the years, except for the occasional bust, like when the Clean Air Act was amended, the jobs haven't kept pace. And in 2015, the jobs were at 3,700, an all-time low. So today, what we know is that we have gone from being able to produce a lot of coal with a lot of miners to producing about half as much coal with less than 4% of the miners' equivalency. Huge, huge decrease in number of people required to mine. And this graph, I think, helps you see that since 2000, even as production has actually been on the rise, the total of number of people that have been employed by the industry has remained relatively stable. And this information is from the Coal Association, who I believe touts the importance of coal mining to the state's industry, and also in the same breath blatantly says, and we can produce as much as we did in 1990 with half as many workers. So we think the jobs aren't going to come back, even as Lan says coal production is going to remain stable here. It's an important resource, highly desirable for markets overseas that are still willing to accept high sulfur coal, and not everybody is, and that's good. And by the way, if you haven't picked this up, we're not advocates for coal. But on the other hand, we're trying to work with the realities that I think we have as they affect communities and the opportunities that brings to mind. Jobs aren't going to come back. How about coal jobs to the local economy? Well, you know, in 2010, we had 3,500 plus or minus jobs. Total employment in the state was 5.9 million, so that represents less than 0.2 of 1% of the total number of jobs in the state. It's not what I expected to hear. And you compare and contrast that with what we know is a booming, vital economy in the renewable industry, energy industry. And that means here too, because these numbers are including solar and wind and energy efficiency and the spin-off jobs that go along with that. So if you compare the 105,000 jobs to, say, the 3,500, but multiply that by 3 or 4, so say you've got about 11,000 jobs that are indirect and direct jobs, there's a huge, huge way to see where we ought to be going from a jobs creation point of view.
Okay, one of the reasons that we believe that the coal industry really needs to pay a fairer share of its cost is the cost of coal itself, in terms of a variety of reasons, one including the externalized costs. But what we see is that the coal industry, because of the political clout it has a strong legislative lobby. It has the benefit of a cultural legacy of people relating to the coal industry, relating to the jobs, and to the history within their families of the jobs, and the times when things were good. Historically, elected officials have poured subsidies upon the coal industry. And yet, if we look at the contribution of the industry to Illinois' GDP, it's 0.3% of our Illinois economy. So in many ways, it's out of balance. We're favoring an industry that we believe is moving out of the picture. To get a handle on the amount of impact that the coal industry has on our Illinois state budget, in 2013, there was a report produced by the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and Downstream Strategies. They looked in detail at the relative costs, the subsidies given to the coal industry versus the benefits, economic benefits. And what they found is that if you take the revenues, and this is from fiscal year 2011, admittedly, the numbers are hard to find on this, and it's a very detailed process, but these folks took a look in 2011, fiscal year 2011, and if you take the corporate taxes, these are the corporate income taxes that come into the state coffers, the coal employee taxes, those are the employees paid, and indirect employee taxes, and these are the spin-off jobs. If you have a coal miner's job, they support the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker in town, et cetera. So if you take all those revenues and then you subtract the expenses, public services required to support the industry, direct economic incentives, grants and subsidies, abandoned mine reclamation, et cetera. And this is just the impact on the state budget at that time. The net impact was a loss of $20 million. In other words, it cost $20 million more to have the coal than the coal company brought into the state coffers. So we think it's time that coal paid its fair share. For a long time, the coal industry has been getting a lot of benefits. And of course, there are a lot of industries that get subsidized, but in particular, the coal industry has a real pipeline to these benefits in the state of Illinois, and we think it's disproportionate to its benefit overall. So one of the reasons is the externalized costs. What does coal really cost us? I mean, we look at our power bill and we see so many cents, 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and taxes on that, et cetera, and we think that's our bill. But there are more costs. And so Externalized costs are those that we don't pay directly. We pay in other ways. For example, the costs of health costs for asthma attacks, heart attacks, strokes, lung cancer, premature deaths. And there are other costs also. For example, in our own state, if you've traveled around, perhaps you've seen some of these acid mine drainage sites, coal slurry ponds, enormous structures full of toxic slurry. Coal ash disposal sites, one of those in our nearby middle fork of the Vermilion River. Subsided farmland, as Pam mentioned earlier, abandoned mine lands. All of these are costs. We pay for these. They're not in our bill, but we pay for them and otherwise. In 2011, the Harvard School of Health, Public Health, did a study, and this is the full life cycle of coal. What does it cost our society to have a coal economy based in part on coal? So they looked at all of the aspects of the costs of coal, including the health, the infrastructure, the overall cost, and what they determined was it costs an additional 17 cents per kilowatt hour on average, over and above your electric bill, your electric cost. It costs 17 cents per kilowatt hour more to pay for all these health and infrastructure expenses. And so this would double or even more than double your electric bill if you were to pay for those outright. And while we're doing that, while we're paying these costs, much of this coal is being exported. The coal companies are exporting the coal. At this point, around 78 to 80% of the coal in Illinois leaves the state. Most of that goes to other states, but about a quarter of that goes to international markets. All that doesn't make it bad, but we think that the coal industry ought to be able to bring back some of that, the wealth of the coal industry to local communities and use that. So one of those ways is through a minor fee, a small fee on the coal produced. So coal severance fee, coal severance tax, if you want to use that word. Top 10 or top 25 coal producers in the U.S., of those, 22 of them have a coal severance tax of some sort. Only 3 do not, and that's Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Those taxes range from a nominal amount in Indiana to 10 to 15% per ton in Montana, in the Powder River Basin. And so 22 coal-producing states have this tax. Let's take a look at what that means in real dollars, just as an example. This is the current spot price of coal. And this was as of actually 1 week ago. You can see the various basins on the left. The Powder River Basin selling at $11.75 a ton. That's highly discounted because of many things, but it's readily accessible coal, but it's also subsidized in part because a lot of this is on federal lands and leases are fairly low priced. The Illinois Basin was selling at $32.60 a ton, and the Uinta Basin, 41.10, Northern Appalachia, 45.45, and Central Appalachia is way up at $57.85 a ton. If we had a 5% fee on Illinois coal, that would be about $1.63 a ton. And if you project that over last year, 2016, when Illinois produced over 45 million tons of coal, the average cost for the year, the weekly spot price, was $1.62 per ton. That would produce about $74 million. That's $74 million that could go back to small, rural Illinois communities, coal communities impacted by the coal industry and the extraction. And the good thing, and this is one of the coal companies surely would say, but that means we'll go out of business, we can't produce as much coal, our wages will go down, miners will lose their jobs. In actuality, the empirical evidence, the evidence of other states, the 22 states who do have severance taxes, and economic studies show that that's not true, that it does not affect production. In fact, there are other costs that are much larger in proportion than a small tax. So that's really what we're proposing to take a look at today. Pam's going to go in now into some of the aspects of that.
I am, because hopefully by now you're ready to say yes, 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 yes. This is a time where we ought to be saying coal companies should pay their fair share and communities should benefit. As part of working with wonderful groups like Faith in Place, who I think all of you know, and Prairie Rivers Network, who all of you know, and Sierra Club, who all of you know, we actually commissioned 2 reports. The first was on the Illinois state budget, and the second was on the coal severance tax. And that helped us begin to put a campaign together that would and actually be something we could take to communities with some pretty concrete information. So this is the report, and we actually used it as the backbone of our campaign because it had great data, and rather than trying to recreate data, we decided to stick with its recommendation, which was, as Lan has just said, a 5% modest fee on coal produced in Illinois, 5% of the gross value of coal produced. So we did, in fact, get together and we said, okay, how are we going to package this? How are you going to, quote, market this coal severance fee to communities? And one of the things, again, following the structure of the report was a few little differences we decided was we could look at this in different pots, right? So where should the money go? Should it all go to communities? Should it go to the state who's experiencing this incredible budget crisis? What about making sure we find ways, as was just beginning to happen more often throughout the country in coal mining areas, what if we too could find a way that would bring revenues back to communities over and above what they would receive from from coal when it was extracted, to carry them out in the future to avoid situations where now you have a tax on coal, now the mining has stopped, now those revenues have stopped, and you got another bust. What could we do? So we decided this. First pot of money would go back to communities. And by communities, I mean coal-producing area communities and counties that were experiencing the most severe impacts from coal mining. And after much discussion, and as you know, if you work in coalition, there's always lots of good debate and much discussion, we decided, okay, we should probably maintain a state component. But one of our first stops was to Mike Madigan's office, and his chief of staff said, you know, the kind of money you're talking about is going to be great for the communities you want to most impact and have an effect upon, but it's not going to do much to solve our budget crisis. So we said, okay, that's like a green light to think a little bit differently, isn't it? So we began to think about ways we could talk about this in terms of grants and infrastructure projects made available to communities across the state so we could, in fact, get support of those elected officials in the most populated areas north of I-80. So we did retain a state component. The third, I think, is the most brilliant. I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. It's a trust fund. And by putting the third of the revenues collected in a trust fund that would not have its principal touched, but would grow and accrue interest over the long run and not be distributed until those times when coal production went down to enough that communities found themselves needing that extra influx of dollars, we had a pretty sound platform to take to the state elected officials, et cetera. We really thought that this trust fund was one of the biggest selling points. And I'll tell you, when you're talking to communities like Carrier Mills, like Christopher, like others I could name, they need the money now. So it wasn't as easy a sell as we thought it would be. But what we also talked about is, in terms of using those resources, again, looking at what other states had done and what states were trying to do to counteract the way the money had been spent, and sometimes on pet projects, whether it's a casino or whether it's something else that doesn't have the kind of impact on communities that we'd hoped for. We thought, well, let's talk about guidelines. Ultimately, we think the communities should decide for themselves. But what we were trying to say is these monies are here to help you take that next step in diversifying your economy. You need them for infrastructure. Beneld, a community in Macoupin County, I don't know how many of you know Beneld. The whole community is sinking. They built a school in 2002. It sunk 2.5 feet, and it was demolished and condemned by 2009, condemned before it was demolished. That kind of thing is happening all across the state. Infrastructure is desperately needed, and that means building roads, sewer, water, lighting. Job training. What do we need to do to help people be prepared for that next new wave of economic development? Healthcare. Black lung is on the rise. People have accidents that are debilitating when they're minors. But also healthcare across the state is a positive and a good thing, as we all know. What about renewable energy? Illinois can still be a leader in energy, can't we? Maybe it's in the renewable sector and not in coal. And then, of course, environmental cleanup. So rather than decide we knew it all, because we didn't, and we still don't, we decided to start out by taking our message to various points in Illinois and held a series of what we called listening sessions, where we talked about the coal severance tax, we talked about the need, the impact on the economy. Folks knew that. They didn't know the numbers, but they're living it, so they knew it. But what we wanted to get from them was their input and their ideas and their thoughts about the distribution as we were proposing it before we went forward. And then we met with some of our elected officials to test the waters. Ultimately, this was to be a legislative solution. So we wanted to make sure we heard from state senators in coal country, meaning central and southern Illinois, but particularly in southern Illinois, because I think that's where the coal has been most mined recently and the impacts are most severe. What about mayors? What do they think? Will they support this? What about county board chairs? What about other opinion leaders that we can call on to help us as we move this platform forward? What about UMWA, United Mine Workers of America? You may not know this, but there was an initiative in 1984 to actually put forward a coal severance tax that lost by just one vote. And that initiative went through the process with county board officials and UMWA by the side of the entity that moved it forward. And what about coal miners? I mean, we heard about the long, steep history and the fact that these guys are making a good job, right? If you're a miner, the average wage is about $85,000, and the press. Then we went forward after gathering all that information and started taking resolutions to communities and counties to get them to sign on. Our thought was, if we get the municipalities, if we get the counties to sign on and start talking to their elected officials, and we were able to do this in concert with UMWA, we'd have a pretty solid program. And then a couple things happened. And all of you have experienced those couple things. One of the things before the election, but during the election cycle, was big coal companies like Peabody Energy, the largest private sector coal company in the entire world, went bankrupt. Y'all read about that, right? As did about 6 other major coal corporations, most of whom were mining right here in Illinois, including Peabody Energy. How do you talk about a tax on coal with a company who's gone bankrupt? Didn't seem like that was going to get too much traction, although we kept going. Because at the same time, those corporations like Peabody Energy were paying $11 million out in bonuses to their CEOs while they were restructuring. And then the election happened. Well, what we found at that time was, well, we lost a key senator that we'd been talking with. The makeup of county boards changed. We actually lost some support by those county boards who actually had decided they would speak up because they were afraid of losing the coal mining operators in their backyards, especially if those were not ones that had gone bankrupt, or they were afraid to speak out to the industry. Then there were resolutions that were going through the House at the same time that were finding a way to help utilities mine Illinois coal, making it more marketable. The United Mine Workers of America, who we really tried so hard to incorporate into the campaign and said they would support us, they were totally immersed, remember this, in trying to get health benefits for their retired miners and pensions for workers after the coal companies went bankrupt and all that was in jeopardy. They didn't have time to return a phone call. And then there was Trump's rhetoric about we're going to make coal great again. We're going to bring back the coal industry. There's going to be a boom in coal. Everybody's going to benefit. You don't want to tax something like that, do you? Everybody's going to benefit. The jobs are coming back, which we think is, hopefully we've debunked that one. And the coal industry, we were making enough noise, the coal industry started to be vocal against us. That's when you know you're gaining some traction, is when in the news you start to say, you hear the Illinois Coal Association president, Phil Gannett, say things like, to counter our message, and to go to county board meetings before we got there so he could spin his message appropriately. So even though jobs were at an all-time low, and they were in 2016, there was a mine that closed in Galatia, and coal companies had overproduced because they thought they were going to have markets in China, and China said no more high sulfur coal, so you have all this coal sitting around. Even though the jobs went from 3,500 to 2,800, people still had the hope of a boom economy. So we said, okay, as we were told when we met with Mike Madigan in his office, there's a season to bring everything forward, and you got to find your timing, and timing has to be right. So maybe this isn't the right time, but guess what? We have a new election coming. We have a whole host of opportunities, we think, when we talk about the renewables economy in Illinois, to get people excited about becoming that new energy economy. And I still think that message of coal companies need to pay their fair share so that communities can benefit from the one-time extraction of coal still plays well, and I hope you do too. So we're going to be back. Just needed to take a break. So with that, I would say we've had a wonderful experience doing this. We're not going to give up. We're going to go back. And when we do, we're hoping that some of you might be willing to work with us and do some of the on-the-ground work that's going to need to be done to carry this forward. And now we'll take questions.
Yes, sir.
You showed a graph that where you're showing the decline in coal production and coal use, but you said when one of the graphs went out to 2050, year 2050, you said, well, coal will still continue to be there for the foreseeable future. What will it be used for?
Well, it's
I know that I need the graph. It's okay.
indeed, there is a trend now with electric power generation moving towards natural gas. But there's still industrial processes, there's still, exports that'll be needed. There's still projected uses for coal, which will be gradually declining, but not disappearing rapidly. And that's really our whole point, is that coal is on the decline. It'll eventually be minimal, I think, in our use, or we won't be around because of the emissions. But while it's still being mined at any level, Illinois is competitive, and We think a small portion of that wealth should go back to help communities that have been impacted. But you know, there will continue to be uses for coal.
Yeah, I think I just want to underscore that, you know, just in Illinois, we have 80% of the coal that leaves the state, which is what Lance said. But it is going to emerging developing markets, right? So our coal is high value in a lot of ways as a commodity in other places, even if it's not here. And if our state, some of our state representatives and senators have their way, we'll find a way that they hope to retrofit our old utilities so we can burn coal here. So I think the energy mix is a bit in flux at the moment. Natural gas prices are going up, which is making coal a bit more competitive again. And some of that competitiveness and resource use is market-driven. So while Land says, and I agree, it's never going to, we don't believe it's ever going to have a boom in this country again. With that said, there's a role for it as we make that transition, because you can't make that transition overnight, and we still have lots of markets overseas, potentially.
Yeah, I think I saw your hand first.
Oh. What is the estimated lifespan for the remaining coal-fired power plants? I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I know that many of the plants, the older ones, such as the two in Chicago, Fisk and Crawford, and a number of others in the state, made decisions to close them because of the costs of bringing them up to current standards. But I don't know what the details I
of
think that too is in flux. You're absolutely right. We have an aging fleet for the most part in the state of Illinois. But if you've not yet heard, Dynegy is in the process of talking to the governor's office about a ratepayer increase that would help them stay competitively in this market. And that's a more complicated thing than maybe I fully understand, but part of that has to do with the way energy is distributed and how they capture their costs, and part of that also has to do with the fact that this aging fleet has not been retrofitted to burn high sulfur coal, and whether that's going to be part of the package, I don't know. But certainly utilities are hoping that's going to be an extended lifespan.
Yes.
I think there may be an analogy to nuclear plants being drawn there. I think you can keep a coal plant going indefinitely, not that anybody wants to do that, but we have this idea that nuclear plants have a lifetime, and that's because of the neutron flux and the question of the containment vessel and that sort of thing. So, but I think we should have a campaign against coal. I'm for your efforts as long as it's being mined, but not a war on coal, but a campaign against it. I mentioned before that some of this money should go into remediation, like trying to stop an L from falling into the ground.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just concerned that we need voices to say keep it in the ground as well as
Coal kills. I mean, it's as simple as that. Coal kills. I'm absolutely there with you. And one of the ways to look at this, and I think I can say that this publicly here, it's not something we wanted to say as we were on the road in southern Illinois where people depend on coal, but it's like one of the things we talked about in the campaign in Chicago to close the coal-fired power plants. Every time you can do something that costs a utility something more or a company something more, it's like putting another nail in the coffin, right? So yes, there are studies that show coal severance taxes don't do corporations in, and by itself it won't. But it's one piece of a larger puzzle that will. And I'm going to say it loudly, coal kills. I'm there with you. We're totally on board with you there.
Yeah, I think you had your hand up earlier.
We received a power bill information sheet required by the state from Ameren the other day. We wouldn't get it if it weren't required, obviously. The basis for our electricity that we use from Ameren was something like about 95% coal-based.
CO2 is, yeah, right, from burning fossil fuels like coal is not good for you, and coal kills. That's all I can say. But this is a dance we had to play. And hopefully you can appreciate some of that, because we are not, as I said, coal advocates, we are community advocates. And I don't know how to stop a market-based economy that has been subsidized by our industry. But what I do know how to do is talk about having communities benefit while we're trying to find a way to make a just transition, which I should also say Lan and I spent the whole summer doing with others, some of the same partners I mentioned before, going to coal communities with a message of a new energy economy based on the incentives and programs of the Future Energy Jobs Act. Because again, if you're looking at markets, that's one way to get where you want to go, I think.
Yeah, I think in terms of anti-coal movement, one of the best things we can do is make sure that all of those externalized costs are internalized as much as possible, and that coal becomes pays it its own way. And at the same time, we're pushing for this new renewable energy thrust that is happening. It's a matter of time, and you know, it's going to happen. But in the meantime, we have to do what we can to take advantage of those coal dollars. Yeah, I think you had your hand up, then we'll get you.
Yes, I have a question about your statement like coal kills. Is that due to the sulfur extract that comes from the burning of coal? So for every like ton of coal, there's a higher containment of sulfur to that, or?
It's not just salt. He says, we
Repeat
talked
the
about
question.
coal kills, and is that related to primarily to the sulfur content?
Yeah, so I mean, we're
Well,
talking about how, I'm talking about this in reference to,
yeah.
like, if you buy Canadian tar sands and you refine it next to the BP
Right, in Whiting.
refinery, then that process is able to remove most of the sulfur, and then when it's burned, it actually has a lower carbon effect, and so I
Well,
think, is there a process like that for coal?
There are a number of technologies for removing pollutants, but the basic understanding is that coal is a highly polluted entity. I mean, it isn't just sulfur; it's a whole multitude of chemicals and elements of metals, et cetera.
Can anybody tell me when to answer this question?
Anyway, I'll let Pam jump in here, but anything you do to remove these pollutants, you still have those pollutants. So they end up in the water, they end up in the groundwater, the drinking water, they end up on the land, polluting the land, they end up in permanent toxic lagoons, and when it's burned, you still have the particulate matter that gets into your lungs, the micro particles that aggravate asthma and cause heart attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a whole menu of problems and pollutants that are related to coal, not the least of which is CO2.
Yeah, I think you kind of said a little bit of what I wanted to say, but there was a series of slides, if you remember, when you think about coal and coal mining, for example. Coal burning does carry with it all the things Lan just talked about in terms of particulates that actually cause premature deaths and cancer and asthma and strokes and heart attacks, et cetera, et cetera. But just mining coal, which is something that I think most of us don't think about the mining life cycle, you end up with huge, like mile in area impoundments that are filled with toxic coal slurry. That's a waste product left over from getting coal ready to ship to market. So you pour in chemicals with the coal, and the coal that's taken from the ground is now exposed to water and air, and some of the stuff that's inert is now released, and you mix that with chemicals, and you have this toxic soup left over that somebody has to be responsible from here to eternity. And historically, in our own infinite wisdom as people, we didn't think terribly much about making sure that those impoundments were lined and we were protecting ourselves from future leakage. So what you're finding in many cases is they are leaking, and they've been built in some cases over floodplains. So now, if you're leaking into waterways and water systems, or in the case of one town in Germantown, which is near the St. Louis area, I believe, ExxonMobil built such a facility over a shallow aquifer, and people they were dying. They were literally dying, and it took 10 years for the EPA to respond to that, and lawsuits repeatedly brought forward, which devastated people we talked to. They lost their life savings. It kills, and it's the whole life cycle. It isn't just the burning; it's the whole life cycle that we all have to think about.
Yes, we went on a tour of the remains of disaster Murdoch mine, and we saw the blue-green in the water. And we talked to a farmer who's been there 75 years, I believe, with his family and young kids. And they have pictures of the sky that was dark a lot of the time when that mining was going on, and the kids had asthma. I'd like to know if you know what the status of Sunrise Coal is.
I'm not as up to date on that as I knew I needed to be before I came in here to talk with you. It is my understanding they're gearing up to come back. It is my understanding that, they've been given the grace period a couple times after they were, how do I say this? Inundated is maybe the best I want to say, with public comments and comments by folks like Prairie Rivers Network who made a big difference in keeping them at bay. But I think they're coming back, and whether that's in a couple of weeks, couple of months, longer than that, I don't know. But the agencies have continued to extend their timeline rather than say, go away, you haven't met the timeline. So maybe there's somebody here in this room who can better answer that than I. But I'd say watch for them to come back.
What is the status of who owned the waste facility over the aquifer, Little Clinton? What is the status regarding they're wanting to bring coal ash from these things to put over that aquifer?
That's another one that I was hoping to get involved in myself personally. I don't know. I think, and Dave, maybe you know better than I do on this. The question is, what's the status of bringing coal ash into the Muhammad Aquifer, which the landfill was gearing up to do, building railroad sidings, et cetera, ready to put it in the landfill. I'm expecting it's going there as we speak. I have no reason to think it's not.
Besides the consent decree that we got a lot of publicity about here, I testified at the time that there was a side consent decree that was done by DeWitt County, where all the really interesting things were, where they were bringing in the railroad tracks, which already went through the landfill originally, and that they were bringing in all this coal ash. Well, they are bringing it in, and if you look at aerial photographs of it now, the landfill itself looks white. They apparently don't have to cover it. They use the coal ash as
The only, yeah, it can, and airborne is horrible, because it gets in your lungs. But the only positive thing I can say about the answer to that question is there is a task force that's been set up. Senator Bennett is pulling people together to look holistically at that problem, not just the coal ash, but other. We need to protect our water, right? Yeah, and coal doesn't do that either. So, yeah.
And there is an ongoing suit against that landfill to close it down by the Muhammad Watch people who live around that area. And it's close to the summary judgment stage at this point.
Okay.
Well,
I have a question if I could add to the Peabody Energy story. Read an article recently that the reason Peabody Energy declared bankruptcy was they had bought a huge coal mine in Australia. It cost a lot of money. So that went on their books as debt. So they looked at their books and said, gee, we've got great debt on our books, we need to declare bankruptcy. So they declared bankruptcy, it wiped out the debt, and they're back in business now. They declared all their old stock invalid, and they reissued new stock. Well, there's complaints now that the new stock that was reissued, was preferentially given to the principals the same people that were behind it, declaring bankruptcy to begin with. So in a way, it's amazing that the bankruptcy judge let them get away with this because they now, have much more ownership in the company than they have before, and they're back in business.
Okay, we're happy to hang around a little bit if you have any other questions, but otherwise, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.